Well, welcome to today's webinar, Global Chaos, Navigating the Crossroads of Progress and Peril, that will feature as our prime presenter, Peter MacKinnon, and also joining us are the contributors to this series, Mel Head, Robert McGarvey, and Charlie Meredith, who, when Peter's finished with his presentation, will have an opportunity to add their 2 cents worth and challenge or bring in new perspectives. And I'll also be asking the viewers if they have something they'd like to share with us. If they could hold off for a half hour and use the chat function. But otherwise, this is an era often defined by unprecedented technological progress and improving living standards. On a world scale, the world finds itself paradoxically in the grip of rising social, economic, political, and geopolitical turmoil at the same time. This complex web of crises is shaping societies on a global scale, and in doing so, demanding the need for urgent action as nations and the world face a critical juncture between progress and collapse. I'm going to leave it at that, Peter, and ask you if you'll carry on from there.
So thank you very much, Perry, for introducing me and for those who wrote this discussion paper penned by Perry and others. I'm very keen to talk to you about this topic. So let's get going. As a background, I just want to point out that Perry asked me to make a critique on your paper, and I decided, because I agreed with everything in it, that I would actually just add to it. And so I've taken a number of quotes from the paper. So you'll see anything that's in double quote is actually taken right out of this paper, Global Turmoil, Navigating the Crossroads of Progress and Peril. But I also didn't do any research. I just did this right off the top, and I agreed with everything. So hence, this is just simply adding to it. And the main thing I've added is I've added in the polycrisis of the environment. So we have two polycrises I'm going to deal with. The one that the paper's about, which is basically, I'll call it the geopolitical polycrisis or governance polycrisis, and the other is related to how we are treating our environment and how it is responding accordingly. So that's the background. And as Perry said, this is basically introduction as he covered. So is corrective action possible in a timely way given the state of the world today? So let's see and let's discuss. And the discussion will be in that two forms, the part that will be both recorded and the after party, as Perry just referred to. So I would argue that the world is slipping into a two-stage interrelated set of polycrises. The first stage is the one that the paper's really about, and that's the crisis in governance. And the second one is this one about natural environment. And I'd like to just give you some highlights on that without going into detail. We're certainly open to discussion on this after the presentation. But I think that the combination of both of these polycrises is leading to a toxic mix of indecision, vested interest, political bickering, and so on. And the net result is all of this is taking time, and it's taking time into when we should be acting. And we're not acting, we're just bickering. So having time to act is critical, and that gap is closing before I think we'll see relatively significant changes to our environment and our governance. We've already started to see some of the change in governance in the last week, certainly emanating from the south of the border. While the gentleman who's going to be the next president is still not president, he's certainly running around like he's president and making decisions or declarations that are like he was president. So without a coordinated global corrective action, there will be catastrophic consequences to humanity and life on this planet as we know it. That is my view. So the global economy stands on the brink as it is today. I mean, we see wars, geopolitics, and serious posturing, environmental degradation, and of course we have Trump. And these all come to mind as things that are going to be shaping the future and the near-term future. I would advocate that the most imminent threat to Canada at this time and to democracy in general is Trump and his transactional shoot from the hip policy approach. We've seen some of that in this last few days. Our prime minister called an emergency meeting of the premiers and territorial then premiers and just held yesterday to deal with the latest threats about tariffs. I don't understand. Trump thinks that the foreign countries and companies will pay the tariffs when in fact it's paid by American companies and the American citizens. So It's a rather strange advice that he's been given or he doesn't hear. And the tariff thing is just an example here, and you already heard about it because when I wrote this, he hadn't made his announcements of 25% tariffs on Canada. And we have, of course, the war in Europe in the 21st century. It just seemed preposterous. We have chaos in the Middle East, although there was a little bit of a breakthrough, perhaps, when the Hezbollah Israeli agreement that has been at least passed by the Israeli cabinet yesterday. But we see still saber rattling increasing in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. North Korea is increasing its nuclear capabilities and its delivery capabilities. So that's also a provocation. So I would argue that stability is fading as the nexus of global power is shifting. And I believe it is shifting, and it's shifting towards China and the East in general. India is on the rise as well. So, on the geopolitics of the nation states are shifting, and I think what we're seeing many countries, and this has been very prevalent in the news in the last few days, is bracing for America's hard turn to the right. And I would advocate, and we'll only know this in a matter of weeks or months, well, months, I would say, not just weeks, but there could be such a hard turn that the autocratic nature of the new president will possibly put U.S. rule of law and international relations in a very unstable situation. And by returning to isolationist world, it seems that Trump is seeking to create an American economy walled off from global fair trade. And I believe that of such action will pass the global economy. Well, if such action passes, that the global economy supports will be passed to China and others in the East. And perhaps it'll even affect the reserve currency. We've seen, of course, that BRICS has been getting more powerful as an organization. Here is where I wish to introduce the environmental polycrisis, and without going into detail, we can talk about this, but this is a good story in terms of the picture, and you can see what is it basically illustrating is things are green is that's safe, things that are in orange is we're crossing some boundaries, and things that are in red is we in effect have crossed sustainability on the planet in those particular areas. And some of these areas we still don't know in detail the scientific details, but we know that they're affecting all these things are nonlinear, interacting with each other, and have various time scales and how they operate. So in 2009, when this idea was first presented as a polycrisis, they called it the planetary limit in those days. And since I've come to call this polycrisis, as have others. But in 2009, there were 7 boundaries that were assessed and 3 had been crossed. And you can see by 2023, 9 boundaries had been assessed and 6 have been crossed. And there may still be some more boundaries added to this model as it's developed. This is integrating thousands of papers from various researchers in these various disciplines and simulating this in a model that is characterized by these charts. So the environmental crisis is accelerating. I believe it is likely going to worsen as America abandons international agreements. I believe Trump will pull out of the Paris Climate Accord day one. I also believe that he'll pull out of the World Health Organization and other such things, including abandoning free trade. His talk on taking aim at his two of his 3 largest America's largest trading partners, Mexico and Canada, seems to throw the agreement that we have as a free trade arrangement right out the window. I mean, I know that Trump always takes a high stakes, go in high and come down, and go in high and then forget about it. So we don't know where he's going to be. I mean, he's so off the wall erratic. It's hard to tell. But he always starts with a high stakes and does generally go down. And then there's the prospect of technology disruptions. And you're well aware of this. We've talked about this in the KI network before, particularly the rise of AI and even CRISPR and things like that. I think synthetic biology is another thing that's underrated in terms of getting enough public attention yet. So let us now, all these next themes are all the headlines in the discussion paper. So the human cost, homelessness, and mental health crisis. This is a theme in the paper. And I would definitely agree that housing faces an endemic shortage in many parts of the world, including Canada. In fact, we've reduced our intake of not refugees per se, but their intake of immigrants just recently because we have a housing crisis, even with those who are currently living in Canada. However, if Trump does deliver on his illegal immigrants in the United States and starts to arrest and in camp and then export them, I would anticipate Canada will be flooded, at least along our border with the United States, and this is going to be a very serious issue. And I think it's going to be an issue all around the world where all the refugees are going to start moving, many because of climate change. Europe has been experiencing this. Of course, the southern United States has been experiencing this, and it is often due to climate change and the other states that climate change has disrupted in their geopolitics of their countries. And I would point out that Trump's plan, as advertised, would actually be on a scale even larger than the Nazis' efforts to eliminate undesirables in World War II. And I learned yesterday that he plans to use the U.S. military as the enforcers. And this is more on the human cost. We also have mental health crisis that's emerging here, and I think it's rooted in a growing fear of the future in the general public around the world, whether it's in communist China or in the United States of America. And it's a growing lack of confidence in oneself and an increasing sense of disillusionment. And the emerging result is an increasing case of substance abuse, uh, growing, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Nope, substance abuse. And growing mistrust in institutions and a collapse in community civics. I mean, that collapse in community civics has been certainly underway for some years now, and civic society is really on its razor edge in terms of being sustainable. So collectively, the stresses of contemporary life are taking a toll on productivity of individuals, families, and communities. And I agree, because this is, of course, I was asked to comment on this paper, that these challenges are a direct consequence of much broader economic instability, and failure to address them will have lasting economic repercussions. So the climate change I would characterize as a great disruptor here. And in that case, you can see that the primary driver is a combination of, I would argue, the human disregard for the environment in general. You just throw out the garbage, even throw it out the window, so to speak, and a consequence of the wastes produced by the unsustainable business model of the global economy. And that is based on the insatiable consumption of stuff, regardless of its intrinsic value. And I use as an example of rather limited intrinsic value, fast-moving consumer products, which are vast amount of plastics, in fact, and often are just poised for a few hours or a few months. One of the biggest challenges arising from coping with climate change is how to address this migration problem I was just outlining. And I think that this will be a massive, probably the largest migration in human population in certainly modern times, if not in historical times as well. The great destabilizer is still working away at the world continues to struggle reconciling economic growth with environmental sustainability. And we still are bickering over that. We just had COPE process come to a conclusion, and it was a very tumultuous event. It was talking about failure 24 hours before it ended, and they did come out with at least some funding for helping underprivileged countries. And it is also likely to create a bifurcation in wealth, the climate change itself, with the rich getting richer and all the rest getting poorer in different levels of poorness. Certainly the middle class losing their status and the poor becoming almost destitute. And as a result, we will see in the process, and it's already there in the sense of migration, human trafficking, bribery, and other forms of malfeasance. And I think they'll only proliferate. And the demographic shifts and urban challenges, another theme in the paper. I would argue that demographic shifts add another layer of complexity to the polycrisis. And in that regard, I mean, fertility rates are collapsing in almost every part of the world. except even in sub-Saharan Africa, which has typically been, up until 30 years ago, 6 to 7 children per woman. And now it's down to less than 4. And in many countries, such as Japan, even China, it's now below replacement. And the most amazing country to be below replacement by 2050 is South Korea, which the United Nations estimates will be 80% below replacement if they don't take any corrective action between now and 2050. And migration, both environmental and economic, is exacerbating tensions worldwide. Urbanization, in my view, is an accelerating force of human migration. So the countryside in many countries has been depopulated, has been depopulating for many, many years. But we see that in the growth of cities. I mean, we now have mega cities of unbelievable size that are, in many cases, in many parts of the world, are filthy and have extreme poverty and lack of proper housing. There was a massive fire, as you may have heard, in Indonesia just the other day, in Jakarta. It was a shanty town. Fortunately, it was reported there was no loss of life, although that was probably a preliminary assessment because it was such an inferno going through a small shanty town of cardboard and plastics and wood. So this will become a monumental crisis when waves of people are on the move and are turned back by destination countries. And Canada's probably going to be the first in the Americas to really feel that because of a geopolitical decision as opposed to the actual environmental crisis. So the next topic in the paper is the crisis of governance and the tyranny threat. And as you can see, I quote in the first line, but I would suggest that many governments are struggling to contain the rising discontent in their societies. And the United States is our close neighbor, and we see that it is turning towards more authoritarian approaches. And this may have worldwide implications. Well, in fact, it will have worldwide implications. This may well be an existential risk to the post-World War II global order as well. I think that we're faced with unknowns at the moment. And the erosion of trust is exacerbated by using advanced technologies in both misuse, misinformation, and disinformation. Misinformation, for those who are not aware, is simply information to lead you down a garden path. It's meant to say it's lies, but it's not trying to hurt you. Whereas disinformation is designed to try and hurt or harm or deceive in a very different way than sort of telling little white lies of misinformation compared to disinformation. And these campaigns are often driven by states as well as by, of course, non-state actors. And international bodies such as the UN, World Trade Organization, are struggling to respond to these cascading crises. And corruption is rampant. In fact, the person responsible for corruption was reporting on corruption, I believe it was a UN agency just a few weeks ago, talked about this past year, they estimated corruption in terms of fraud was like $15 trillion. That's a pretty significant amount of money, several times the size of Canada's economy. So I totally agree with all the above quotes as seen in the paper. And geopolitical tensions and global conflict is another topic in the paper. And I argue that the geopolitical tensions are on the rise, and they're driven by both a failure in diplomacy and the waste of materials that are coming from the pollution that we cause through our business as usual model. Because that is driving the economic side of it. Wealth has become a concentrated, and we're seeing a very big imbalances there. And geopolitical tensions are being fueled by governments investing vast sums of money in dual-use technologies. And the best examples is I would say, the competition between America and China over artificial intelligence and its capabilities, both for use in a positive sense and for being used in weaponry and other forms of intelligence gathering. for the benefit of the state. Major geopolitical tensions are emerging in the use of advanced information and communications technologies, as I was just saying here, and that this trend is such that it will only get more realistic and more common. That, I believe, is definitely happening, and we can see the improvement in the technology just in the past decade. If you ever played with large language models a decade ago, what you could do then versus what you could do now is just a light year ahead. So, and I would argue that at an extreme, AI misuse due to misjudgments of various sorts by humans could lead to raising the potential for global conflict. Now, another topic in the paper is technology, and that's we call it a double-edged sword. But I want to point out that in the past 30 years, the leading edge of innovation has followed a path defined by bits rather than atoms. And what I mean by that is we've shifted from making things out of atoms to making frictionless, massless software, which can easily be replicated and globally accessible at scale. So this is a whole new world when you have that kind of, atomless technology in effect. At the same time, software such as AI agents and large language models have dual use. And with dual use, of course, you have the potential for trouble. And that's the double-edged sword. So one side is on the good side, the other side is on the bad side. Let's hope that the bad side is really dull and not too sharp, and that we can proceed with a good sharp side to advance society. And the promise of the future is that their use of these is applied in this beneficial way, which I guess I was just saying. However, such technology is in the wild now, and it's now virtually impossible to stop its weaponization and to control its spread and use at the current state of AI technology, say as an example. And they're already pretty sophisticated in terms of being able to deceive and cause harm. And weaponizing AI can be beneficial to bad actors. And you all know who these would be. I don't need to say them. I'm probably most concerned actually about lone wolves, because it's in the wild and they're basically accessible by smartphones. And there's now billions of smartphones in the hands of individuals around the world. And they have access to this technology and they know how to prompt, if they can prompt in English or some others. Many of these tools actually support multiple languages. So it can be done in a number of languages that they prompt. So we're in for some wild ride, I would say, in the next decade. And we'll start seeing evidence of that much sooner. Virtually no regulation exists yet in terms of AI. There's only voluntary guardrails. You've probably all heard that the European Union has passed an AI Act. That act doesn't come into effect for 2 years. So it's still a wild game, even in Europe, with only guardrails in place as far as voluntary nature. So the path forward, we're almost finished here. The path forward is basically some questions here, and then this is going to lead us into our discussion. Is there a manageable path forward? Let's see. It depends. Globally coordinated action is fragile at this point, undertaken as a disruptive Trump resumes control of America. And I would advocate it, maybe control he won't give up. How long is a Trump day? How long is a day in Trump world? Is it 1 day? He said he'd be dictator, or does that mean day one is 10 years long? As the world grapples with this convergence of crises, the need for coordinated action is urgent. However, the will to exercise coordination appears to be weakening. The interconnectedness of these challenges demands unprecedented levels of international cooperation and innovation, yet the global community stands at a critical crossroads between progress and peril, and the choices made now will determine whether we plunge further into chaos or manage to harness the forces of progress. We as individuals and citizens of the interconnected world are being challenged while dark clouds abound. Is this possible under the current dual-pronged global polycrisis? Trends seem negative, as almost all threats are increasing. The stakes have never been higher. The need for action is as critical as controlling nuclear weapons and their related proliferation. Canada must recognize this chain of crises as an opportunity for transformative change at all these different levels. The time to act is now before the world slips irreversibly into the chasm of chaos. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you your first question. I mean, first of all, you've done a magnificent job in your environmental scan of what we've been discussing for the last month. Someone said to me this week, is there anything positive in the perspectives that we're sharing? And I have to say that the classical way of approaching this global challenge that we've got, because you pointed out that the forces and sources of change that you're wrestling with are virtually all global and all massive, and all of them have been exposed to an attempt at international regulation, which has failed. And so that our institutions are being challenged, and even democracy is being challenged. And maybe everything that we've been doing, it almost sounds like an apocalypse, and let's hope that maybe it's time for Jesus to come back, although some say that's what the evangelicals think Trump represents. The classical way of dealing with crises of this nature is on this continuum from more control to the state to more control to the people. And yet we've got a new actor in the game, and that's AI. With promises that maybe AI has arrived at a time when nothing seems to be working anymore from a governance perspective to regulate these excesses. Everything seems to be out of control and growing, whether it be environmental, the excesses of neoliberalism, the vagaries of capitalism, which seems to be going unregulated, and it's supposed to be regulated. Even capitalists acknowledge there's a role for the state, but it seems to be failing. So I'm going to open the discussion now to the panel, and first, of course, say again, thank you, Peter. That was an exceptional summary of what of where we've arrived at. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, Robert, Charlie, and Mel. Give you the first shot. Robert, you unmuted first, so I'm going to ask you to pick up from here and try and focus not on reiterating the crisis, but what might be done about it.
Yeah, I think that's where my mind went right away. Thank you, Peter. It was a tour de force. I must say that's intimidating selection of crises. But I'm reminded that this has happened before. The 16th century was an era of massive reform that impacted all four vectors of social power and destroyed the international system that existed at that time in the Western European sense. And so we have precedents of multiple crises impacting institutions, destroying what we think is an established order. And for my mind, are there lessons to be learned from the 16th century? And I think just, I don't know if they're direct parallels, but one of the things that I've been studying a lot is the what they call a commercial revolution, which is the first asset revolution in Western economy. So the economy today was transitioning from a feudal agricultural sort of noblesse type of world to a world governed by trade. And the countries that accelerated out of chaos understood that trade was going to dominate the world economy, and they instituted reforms to make that happen. So the northern Italian city-states, the Dutch, the British, they began to look at their whole institutional infrastructure, which had been organized around the feudal model, and they had to completely reinvent it. And I think very much the same way, the same kind of thing exists today. Our our institutional infrastructure is very industrial in its orientation. And we've had this economic revolution that's driven by intangibles, as you say, atomless kinds of value. We don't measure that value properly. It's not incorporated into our GDP or productivity analytics. It's not, banks can't get their hands around their protocols to deal with intangibles. And so this transition, I think, is historically, if you can get the economy right, you can start to generate the resources necessary to fix some of these other problems.
Okay, so Peter, there's a phrase in accounting called get them by their measures and their hearts and minds will follow. And you're advocating that maybe we've been measuring the wrong thing. We have a new economy based on intangibles, and this in itself may cause a rethinking of the allocation of wealth as it exists in society at large. Have I got that right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the summary. Peter, you wanna jump in there? Anything you want to add?
Thank you for that, Robert. I would argue that you're right about the 16th century, but that's the geopolitical crisis, polycrisis, if you like. It's the first one the paper's really about. I would argue that the 10th century combined both the political geocrisis and the climate change. I mean, the Vikings came out of the north because it was getting colder. I mean, Dublin was by the Vikings. The Vikings were trading with Constantinople in those days by inland rivers. And then, same as northern France, that Vikings were settling there because of the inferior.
The Little Ice Age, that was a significant part of the 16th century as well.
That was the 16th century. Yeah. This was the 10th.
Okay, but if you want to raise history, I mean, the transition from BC to AD was a byproduct that brought new leadership to the world and a new perspective called Christianity in the West. Something was happening at that time, which was a moral crisis that led the entire Roman Empire to ultimately be crippled. We have seen turmoil.
And then 800 years later, we had the rise of Islam. So, I mean, yes, these have been major transitions in history. But I think the one we face today with roughly 8 billion people on the planet is the most complex, intertwined set of problems that we've ever faced.
Well, and we've got these institutions that have been grown up over the last 50 years, all of whom claim, give us more power and we're going to fix this. And none of them seem today to have the regard at an international level, although they spend the money and they have their gatherings, whether they be gatherings in Europe or gatherings in New York at the United Nations. They haven't proven to the public that they have the capacity any longer to contain some of the things that they were in fact established to resolve. Mel, your turn.
Yeah, I think I agree with both what Robert and Peter have said, but I think we have today something that they didn't have back then. We have speed of communication. Something happens in one spot and everybody hears about it, whereas 1,500 years ago, it took some time for things to happen, and the effect was more local. It grew from there, but it affected a lot more people. Here, something happens just like yesterday. Australia, they said 16-year-olds can no longer use social media. Last night, Mark Zuckerberg met with Musk at Mar-a-Lago for dinner. There was a big rift between Musk and, not Musk, but Trump and Zuckerberg, not them far back. I think today also, and I think I had mentioned a little bit in the last week, where if we see something today or hear something and we don't understand it, we typically will either ignore it or tend to believe what somebody has told us it's all about and just move on. We don't tend to look into it. So everybody's got a fuzzy understanding of the world. The person who's going to be doing the communication as well, just look at the communications between the president of Mexico and Trump just yesterday, where Trump said that Mexico is going to shut down the borders. And he was very quickly corrected that they're not going to shut down their borders. So there's a lot of alignment that's got to be done, and we have to do something. We can't just sit still, because the problem will not be solved by doing nothing. But we have to think about what we're going to be doing and think it out a little bit, discuss it with people. There is, no one way to move forward. I don't have the comment on the screen here, but somebody had just put up, about the, where was it? What are the chances that the possibility of a humane and successful future no longer exists? That today we only face various versions of collapse. It's the doomsday scenario kind of thing. It's so easy to see the dark side of it all. So anyway, I don't know if I've added to that.
I will ask you if you could elaborate on one thing though, because you have said frequently, I think I've raised this with you before, we need to do, who is the we?
Us, everybody.
Okay, so that probably takes us to our educational system and or whomever is, it used to be the church. I mean, the church gave people values, they had faith in the church, and the church imparted a certain moral culture that said to people, these are the things you believe, this is how you will behave. We don't have that instrument any longer, other than those that are evangelical.
It's hard to find leaders.
Yeah. Okay, so the we is ultimately, where's the leadership going to come from so that we can in fact become aligned and begin to address some of these, either the global issue or the polycrisis as Peter cites. Okay, your turn, Charlie. You wanna jump in here? I know you're down in the States and you're probably full of turkey, so I don't know quite to expect.
Well, turkey's later, but Perry asked me to come to these things. I'm a contrarian, so that's I'll be that. I'll start with: do we have a crisis today that's worse than 50 years ago? As an elementary school kid, I remember doing air raid drills, hiding under my desk to protect myself from nuclear fallout. There was an air raid siren in my schoolyard that would blare. You could hear for 2 miles away. My dad was away serving as air crew on the DEW line to go shoot down Russian bear bombers when they were going to come. I think of the 60s. I was born in 1960. So as a little kid, I'd see things on TV, the Vietnam War, the shootings at Kent State, the turmoil of the 60s. When you look back on the turmoil of the 60s, I remember the crisis in Biafra. And who the hell remembers where the Biafra even is now? I look at those things and think back, are things really worse today than they were in 1970? Maybe 1975, 1980. What has changed in the world of then to now is technology. I think Mel hit it on the head. We now have visibility of everything in the world on an instantaneous basis, where in 1970, waited for the Time magazine to come out next week that told you what happened the week before, maybe. We had a small group of media companies, radio, TV, and newspapers would curate and filter the news and tell us what they wanted to tell us. Today, we have social media with 8 billion people telling us what's going on in the world. So I'd be the contrarian and say, are things really worse today or not? On the climate change thing, the geophysicists say, look, we're coming out of an ice age and things are warming up. Absolutely. And although Bill Gates was pilloried for it, the real answer is go kill about 3 billion people. That would solve a lot of our problems. I'm not advocating that, obviously, but we have too many people. And even if nobody's using more energy, et cetera, just the natural population growth, that's the issue. That's the basic issue we got to deal with. So we're seeing a migration of people. Again, the contrarian side, a friend of mine, his sister was an immigration judge in the US for 10 years. And she said 99 of 100 people that came before her were economic refugees, nothing else. They're looking for a better life. Why didn't people from Biafra in 1970 come to the US where people from Guatemala or wherever come to the US today? I would counter that the travel is easier now. Even for the poorest people in the world, travel is easier now than it was in 1970. You couldn't possibly leave Biafra in 1970. In 2024, can you? Can you come? I see Yogi's comment, and there's some good points there. Technology, communication, etc., has to have changed, but nothing else has changed. But we're seeing people now want to move. So now we're in the U.S. and I realize most people in the seminar despise Trump, and I'm probably one of the few that's going, yeah, I kind of like what he's doing. For that matter, we have 10 million people in the U.S. illegally, and I saw from the House of Commons yesterday or the day before that there currently is 500,000 in Canada that are in Canada illegally, that taxpayers ultimately are responsible for, and we have economies that may or may not even be able to support these people. So you have, the age-old argument, the takers versus the payers, and do the payers want to pay for the takers? And then you juxtapose that across the world. How many payers, how many takers? And to the first comment, has the world changed? Do the 1% of the population, how much of the world's wealth do they own? Has that number really changed? If you go back to the dirty 30s, did the 1% own less of the world's wealth or more of the world's wealth in 1930 versus 2024? I don't know that answer, but I don't think it's radically different. I really don't. I do think that the people who have the money today have changed. The new industries, new tech, new farm, etc., have certainly made a ton of money, no doubt. But you got to serve somebody, and that truism hasn't changed in the world.
So not to dismiss your point, Charlie, but it takes a senior to tell a younger generation that, gee, it was pretty bad in earlier times. But I want to let Peter pick this up from here.
I appreciate your comments, Charlie, and I think I agree with much of what you said, except the bit about Trump. I would argue though that what you were talking about really in all the examples you gave was about the geopolitical or the political kind of economic business part of the
Right.
polycrisis. It wasn't about what we stressed to the environment. We're stressing the environment beyond carrying capacity of the planet in all kinds of ways. I mean, climate change is the one you hear about, but biodiversity collapse is a stunning consequence of
I agree.
changing
I agree.
climate. And biodiversity collapse is going to affect the food supply. I mean, pollinators are dying off. I mean, the huge quantities of huge numbers of species that have disappeared. I mean, life, we don't even know what the actual extinction rate is versus, new life forms that we can't tend to discover. But nonetheless, it appears that the basic life forms at all levels on Earth, on the soil, in the oceans are going down. And this is a serious problem. I mean, we're seeing acidification of the oceans as an example.
My particular bias here, Peter, as we bring this to a point where I want to draw on the audience, is what we have as a crisis in the collapse of governance. Every issue that we pointed to, we have some vehicle, some instrument that we claim is in place in order to contain what is now global issues, whether it be peace or war with the United Nations, whether it be economic and wealth disparity, whether it be the issues of the environment and climate change. There is some body that claim, and yet those bodies have been inadequate, which is what triggers people like Trump emerging and saying, your democratic neoliberal model has not worked or is not working at this moment. And so at this moment, we need to balance, because governance has its ebbs and flows. There's points in time where you centralize authority in order to deal with a crisis, and there are moments when you decentralize. So we may be in that moment where we're seeing on a global scale the appetite for centralization of power in order to address these individual or collectively. And that's where I think AI may be a vehicle that is new to the game that might aid our capacity to govern and control the mass communication systems, which are only serving to amplify the crisis. If perception is reality, everyone on Earth today feels that they are participating in these issues. This is no longer a matter of your community or even your nation. These are global in nature, and people are participating in them as global citizens. I'm going to ask the audience now for perspective, and I'll pick on a favorite, a friend of the past, someone who understands environmental scanning, has done this for a lifetime, and also understands the relevance of religion or faith in how we orchestrate a society.
Since we've talked last, Perry, I should just give you a quick sense of where my own work has taken me. I've always been one, just given my intellectual background and the fact I was probably dropped as a baby, to want to dig deeper into things than our culture, our modern culture, is inclined to do. Our modern culture is, in my view, the kind of culture that if we see things as a problem, and if a reasonable solution emerges, we chase after it. We don't ask, is there even a better solution? We want to be active getting stuff done. That's not my inclination. And I've come to the conclusion that our modern culture, and I use that as a technical term, that that as a culture, we who are modern, and I mean by that what developed in Western Europe over the last 900 years and came to North America in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, a little later than that to Latin America and a Southern European version of it. My sense is that we do not yet understand the nature of the trouble we're in. And I don't mean it as a shot at any of us. We're all serious people here. I've known you and Peter in particular for many years. But I've come to the conclusion that we do not have a good diagnosis of what we're suffering from. And in the absence of a sound diagnosis, we end up in a situation where we've essentially, our future is just left to random chance. And so when I asked, is it conceivable that all we face, and I say it's interesting that the response was, well, that's doomster. I mean, we wouldn't say that to our doctor. If our doctor said to us, I'm sorry, we have to have a serious conversation. You only have 6 months to live. We wouldn't say to him, oh, God damn it, you're a doomster. I'm going to choose a different doctor. And yet, as a culture, we have no capacity to sustain dark thoughts about our future. Zero. There is no government in the world, there's no institution in the world that takes that possibility seriously. We only look for some kind of happy talk. And I no longer find that for me, that doesn't work. I've done enough work in terms of both the numbers and the intellectual constructs that I think we're in trouble we don't yet understand.
Okay, so you put the focus on the diagnosis, as we've talked about symptoms en masse without truly understanding what is there an ultimate driver? Because if we don't understand the diagnosis, then the solutions that we're going to come up with will be classical, the allocation and reallocation of power. And,
yes.
And maybe there's the flaw. I know we have toyed with this idea as we've wrestled with this environmental scan, this global chaos that we've referred to, and saying as AI has emerged and as these problems emerge, they are so complex that the institutions don't understand them. We keep on blaming them. Maybe we have the wrong model of governance, and maybe that model, we've even looked at faith and whether or not we need to see a restoration of faith in society because our institutions or our logic is failing us. So I think you're toying with something quite consistent with what we've been wrestling with is, do we really understand what the ultimate driver in all of this is? Some will say capitalism, some will say neoliberal, some will say disparity, some will say the problems of the climate. I think you're onto something, that maybe we need to be a little more patient.
If I may, we need, I mean, it's funny. If you actually look at what the first Enlightenment science has done over the last 350 years, when it's been up against a puzzling something that it doesn't understand, it's actually tried to understand kind of how it works and at deeper and deeper levels, including down, as we know in physics, into a place that takes you well beyond Newtonian physics. One of the things that interests me today, just as a phenomenological observation, if you look at this conversation, the fact that it's going on around the world, it's a very small minority of the 8 billion of us, but there are significant people in every place in this conversation, one way or another, and none of them have a mental model of how human civilizations work.
Well, the one hypothesis which we've toyed with is the beginning of the end of the knowledge economy, is the belief that much of what we are seeing is attributed to this pursuit of knowledge that somehow after the Middle Ages was going to be our path to glory. But the institutions that profess today to know have failed us.
Well, it's deeper than that. I mean, I would argue that we need an understanding of history that hangs on an evolution of changing human perceptions of the nature of reality, the nature of human persons, and what it is for human persons to know reality reliably. And I'm trying to drive to a model that can be applied to distinguish in reasonably clear terms why human history has developed as it has. That is, we came from our de novo ape ancestors. The interesting firing order in terms of human forms of civilization is indigenous, agriculture-based settlement, and then modern techno-industrial. There's no evidence on the planet that the bonobo apes evolved into Homo sapiens who then immediately became modern or immediately became settled, agricultural. We don't even have adequate models. We can describe those things and we can talk of some of the features, but there aren't, to my satisfaction, an adequate model of how and why that happened. If that's the case, then we're back to, well, if we don't understand how it works, how can we possibly, what does it mean when we toss around words like we need some kind of transformation that's both personal and cultural, when we really don't have a model of what we just said, what that means?
Okay, well, you've thrown the big question on the table. There's a lot of time is spent on diagnosis, but we've got a very poor handle on coming up with the answer, and therefore it's premature to declare just what the solution is going to be.
Amazing questions. I think we should continue the conversation at a future time on the questions that Ruben asked, some very big civilizational questions, and I think they merit a conversation or a session.
Well, that, Greg, as you know, is exactly what triggered the entire series on the global chaos, was not so much the diagnosis, which we've spent a fair amount of time on, but coming to the conclusion that there is no single driver. There appears to be something even more macro, and I think that was what Ruben's getting at, is we still don't yet understand what's driving or the inability to resolve.
The one point I'll make to add some value to the conversation that I missed is the word reflexive, and that really frames in one word this idea that we are literally goldfish in a bowl. We don't even know that we're in water.
Right.
And to really understand the situation we're in now, we have to look from beyond the limits of the bowl at ourselves as a civilization.
We had a premier once who said, "Look in the mirror," but he's not with us anymore.
Quite a number of statements have been made about pivotal moments in history. Somebody talked about the year 1000. We talked about the Renaissance, I'm sure, or the Enlightenment, or we could go further back and talk about the start of the Roman Empire or the invention of the plow or any other number of technologies. I wonder if, oh, and by the way, every one of those pivotal moments, including the invention of the internet and the steam engine and all of that, there was great anxiety, the same kind of anxiety that's being expressed here today. And in every case, of course, mankind has dealt with that pivot, dealt with both the positives and the negatives that arose from that pivotal moment. Can we really say this is different? Now, you know, what Peter has said is very persuasive that this might be different. But is it? And I'm just throwing that out because frankly, I don't have an answer to that. But I think spending some more time on that would be useful.
Well, we'll find out in time, won't we? Go ahead, Dale.
Well, I will find myself in the minority because I believe that the leadership we're looking for is, in looking at Daniel Smith and Trump, provide something that we can come behind and actually work towards and together with. The challenge we have right now, I see in this group, even as we speak, is the ability to get both sides to learn a handshake that is going to allow us to address the social change that is going to be happening in the fourth industrial revolution. As Yogi has already identified, in each of these levels of freedom and or not freedom, we forgot the move from kings to the Magna Carta. That was a major change in how much we're free. So if we want to put context on what freedom is, I think we have to be more transcendent. And you understand my position on that. I put in here, as a Christian, I believe we have a way forward. It's never going to be perfect, but it is based on our response and willingness to engage in solving the problem together. And one of the things I love about this group is that they're very interested in doing that. One of my frustrations is the lack of willingness to look at the leadership as is and provide a solution, which I think we can create. Thank you.
You're not alone in your perspective. So, you know, portraying yourself as being alone. You've got over 50 million people in the United States that believe that something is wrong. They may not all agree on what that thing is, but like it or not, they have agreed on allocating power to the White House, to the House of Representatives, to the Senate, to the instruments or tools of government in one nation that has extraordinary power, and a president who says, I'm going to fix these things. Now that's an autocracy. It's a fear of tyranny. But in the ebb and flow of democracy, it's one of the instruments that exists. And whether or not it will work or not, like it or not, we're going to be watching. We're on the sidelines in Canada. There will be consequences. They may be negotiated. Let's hope so.
Can I reframe just 1 second? You used the word tyranny because often I see the language as being presently used. What's the difference between tyranny and leadership if we're leading something to peace? If we stop the war in Ukraine, and if we see the Abraham Accord that was broken down by the Democrats reinstated at some level, and that actually happens, what is the big concern we have with the leadership that we have?
There is a concern. If the centralization of power is necessary in order to address a problem.
But you called it tyranny, and I'm calling it leadership.
Okay. Look, it's the first time I've had to apologize today. I'll use a different word. Thanks for power.
I used tyranny, Dale, because that was in the essay I was reviewing. So.
All right. Dave, you may have the last word, Dave. iPad.
Great, thanks very much, Perry. My particular focus is actually on a younger generation and how they may be reacting. I mean, Peter, that was an outstanding presentation, but it's so depressing. And I think we need to be careful here in terms of the impact it has. What I'm doing actually is I have 3 students that are working with me, and Robert Walker, who's the ex-president of ACL, and Dan Wayner, the ex-chief scientist from National Research Council. We've been looking at this issue for over a year. We have 2 groups of students, one at Carleton University, looking at developing a short kind of documentary in terms of the polycrisis and doing surveys to try and find out how younger generation really are beginning to look at this. We have another group of 4 students at Algonquin in their 4th year looking at the application of AI in terms of understanding, going deeper into the polycrisis, the interconnections among the economic, social, environmental, geopolitical, and technological kind of issues that are there. There's a great framework there that, of course, the World Economic Forum has in terms of linking these things together. And, the Cascade Institute, in fact, has done a lot of work in terms of looking at the cause and effect relationships. So what we're trying to do is to understand the global polycrisis better and how it works, its interfaces among each other. Secondly, the domestic impact on Canadians. And then thirdly, our approach is to look at the science, technology, and innovation ecosystem as a possible mechanism to be able to try and respond effectively to many of the issues that are emerging. And we made a presentation to the Canada Science Policy Conference last week in Ottawa. We also did a survey to ask people, how concerned or very concerned are you about the polycrisis? 98% concerned or very concerned, but 77% feeling that it's urgent or very urgent to try and respond to this. And in terms of who is the stakeholder that's most vulnerable or needs to be looked at, so Perry, it reinforces your idea in terms of governance, it was governments. That is the nexus in terms of who's got to take action to try and more effectively deal with this. So we're developing a concept of citizen-centered innovation, reversing the polarity so that you really shift from a focus on developing things in firms and you really look at purpose and people. And I think this gets back to Ruben's comment, which I really liked. If you go into a much deeper level, there's a famous cartoon by Pogo that says, I've seen the enemy and it is us. I actually believe what we need to understand is human nature, that all of the people on this call, we are the problem and we will be the solution as well. So I'm really zeroing in on trying to understand that. And I appreciate very much, again, Perry, just being able to listen into this and so on, and love the views that are coming out here. So thank you very much.
I'm delighted that you brought a cohort to the table that is not represented today, and that is our youth. And they are well aware that something feels wrong. They do not have 80 years of life experience to know whether or not it's ever happened before, and to them it's irrelevant whether it's happened before. If whatever is happening to them today, what can be done about it? My concern is that they will be directed by the instruments of power today to do it in a classical manner, to solve the problem the way we've tried to solve it in the past, by allocating and reallocating power, by inventing new institutions. I think collaboration goes a long way in terms of trying to find an answer, but I don't think we should be telling our kids what the answer is, so they will become mobilized like they have through protests, whether it be BLM or the springs in the Middle East. Somehow they and we together need to find a new answer by the sounds of it. So I'm going to leave it at that. I will let you give you the last word, Peter. So you've got a minute to wrap this up.
Well, thank you for all of the comments and questions. I like the fact that it was mostly comments, in fact, from Ruben's and Greg's to David's, and all in between, Dale's, etc., Yogi's. I mean, all of these comments are really good. I think that I left it as a question mark, in effect, at the end of this, to have a discussion. And now it's, of course, your group, and this, I think, is a positive thing in the sense of trying to bring further awareness to the bigger problems that are facing us and integrating our environment with our government.